Hello, listeners. Welcome to another episode of our podcast on exponential talent. I'm Shreya Sarkarbarni from Human Capital Growth. Our guest today is Hariraj Vijayakumar, founder and CEO of Designs and Change, a firm that enables enterprise transformation. I met Hari way back in 2008 when I launched Human Capital Growth, and Cognizant Technologies became one of our first customers. Hari at that time was leading the effort to measure enterprise-wide learning, and we partnered on building a measurement strategy. Working with Hari was an extraordinary experience. He was always curious and focused on driving impact. He never shied away from taking on challenges and almost always was successful in getting his stakeholders on board. It was no surprise when Hari became the Chief Learning Officer of Cognizant, and we continue to partner. Hari is one of those rare leaders who listens well, who can genuinely engage in brainstorming and help you land in a better place than where you started. He's always been an ardent supporter of evidence-based practice and has influenced the way our Talent Academy has shaped up. Today, I'm excited to share with the rest of the world Hari's extraordinary thinking. So, Hari, welcome to our podcast. Thank you for joining us today.
Shreya, thank you so much for having me over onto this podcast. Quite excited to have any kind of conversations with you. And that this topic is quite exciting. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, appreciate it. So let's just dive in and talk about your career journey. It's a fascinating journey. You started out as an IT analyst, rising to becoming a client partner, heading a P&L, but then you made a switch. You went over to the people side, becoming the Chief Learning Officer, and now an entrepreneur, sort of helping companies more at an enterprise level, dealing with their business issues, leadership, helping them transform. And that's quite a broad spectrum of things to cover. So my question to you is, how have your experiences shaped the way you think about the people practice and what it takes for enterprises to thrive through their talent?
Yeah, great question. I have had a lot of time to think about how my mosaic of a career has really helped me in my thinking, how I formed myself as a leader, and how does it really help me in my day-to-day work. So I think towards the last few years, I have had more time to reflect on it. And interestingly, I've had a fairly interesting career where almost, I would say, every 2 years, I shifted out of something I was doing and kind of almost switched out to a different kind of work. I think at least for the first 16 years of my career, I probably did that. And I think that's kind of really, really helped me. And I'll just take examples, right? Just giving you sense from different phases of my career. So I started off as a technologist, right? I think as Shreya said, it taught me the importance of effectiveness of work. So I understood that everyone doesn't work the same way, even if we are doing the work, a similar kind of work. So started off as a software developer and figured out that there are software developers and then there are 10x developers. People who really produce an output that's equivalent of the output 10 times the output that an average software developer would produce. So I started understanding firsthand the logarithmic scale, not the linear scale, that's involved in the work effectiveness. Similarly, then I shifted off into business consulting and then later off into program management. That phase taught me the importance of efficiency and the importance of personal leadership, especially when it comes to interpersonal effectiveness. So I started really exploring it firsthand. I did not have a formal training on leadership development. That phase really taught me firsthand how I need to actually get better in terms of influencing and gaining mind share with my customers, as well as figuring out how do I become very efficient in what I do. How do I plan my work? How do I actually get very effective in small team settings? Stuff like that. Sales and P&L taught me actual business management, really going all the way from business models to key decisions. What are those elements came through from my sales and P&L experience. I did operations role. It taught me how to build scale. As Shreya alluded to earlier, the company I worked at, scale was a necessary attribute. Every 2 years, the company almost grew double its size from what it was. So really, operations taught me how to manage scale, how to build scale. And then in search of non-linear impact, I shifted off onto the people side of the business. And really in talent and learning, I started exploring the non-linear levers of human performance. So really on the business side, I was always focused on figuring out how to actually go after larger goals. Here also, you're going after larger goals, but in a very non-linear way. And that's really what I kind of played around with. And then entrepreneurship really taught me to put it all together. How do you create, how do you deliver and capture value while working very, very closely with the customers, right? How do you bring in all of these experiences together in one fell swoop, right? And I think that's kind of what entrepreneurship and this journey has been for me. Hopefully that kind of long-winded, but I hope that I answered you.
That definitely helps. I think the core of your message was how do you create value, and that value in your early stages was around how do you find these 10x developers, if I may put it that way, because they create exponential value. How do you establish your goals so you're delivering, bigger results for your organization? How do you align your people so you can get nonlinear growth through your people? And now at an enterprise level, sort of bringing it all together. And I think that's a really fascinating journey. And what I would like to explore next is particularly diving a little bit deeper into your time when you were the chief learning officer, and now that you've had a chance to go back to working sort of across functions. What do you believe is missing in L&D or HR? And I'm not talking specific to Cognizant, but in general, as you track what's happening in business, what's missing? Because many people talk about, or there are some who are calling for abolishing HR. And in your comments, you mentioned that it's possible to achieve nonlinear growth, which is what caused you to move to the people function. So give us your insights.
Yeah, I'm quite opinionated in this space. First, to specifically talk about this whole abolishing the HR function, kind of going to one extreme or the other, right? So taking a very pure model versus going into a very much this extreme model of saying, oh, we don't need HR. I don't think either extremes would work. And I truly believe the folks who call for these extremes don't understand the complexity there, right? So they don't really understand that when you're working with organizations, you're working with complex adaptive systems. You need to have both the rigor in performance, which is what really needs to come from the way you manage business. So in many ways, HR or people functions must be run with the same rigor as businesses are run, but also with the same level of depth as any professional practice organization would be run. So take legal, for example, right? So legal practices. So you've got to have both depth and rigor. You really cannot go with one over the other and say, look, we can go to that extreme. And I think that's kind of what is absolutely required. Because you are looking at even if you're talking about a group of 50 people, you're still talking about a fairly complex system. It's a complex adaptive system. It has all kinds of fairly non-intuitive attributes around self-organization, around emergence, interdependence, things like that. So, and these are not things that are going to come intuitively just because you kind of winged it in a very disciplined manner. And that's what a business leader can do if they just would look at it and without any acknowledgement of the HR practices, if you start to run it just like a pure business, I think you would kind of run it to the ground. This same thing goes, right? If you're actually on the other side, if you just run it like pure play practice organization, almost like a research organization with a lot of depth, you're just not going to get the rigor, and therefore you're not going to get the outcomes, either directly or impacting the right outcomes for the business. And therefore you're just not going to have the money share with it. We kind of have to strike that balance between the two. Hopefully that made sense.
You said something really important over here. You talked about the need for the HR function to bring rigor and depth that you cannot intuitively figure out. So can you now talk about, in general, does HR have the rigor and depth that does not exist in the business leader?
HR by themselves don't have it. At least that has been my experience, not just working in organizations, but also having met a lot of chief HR officers, chief people officers, chief learning officers over the last, I would say last 10 years, across the world for that matter, right? I think in US, in Europe, as well as in India, one of the prominent themes of conversations always has been, why are we kind of skewed so much towards the depth side or towards the rigor side, right? And not really able to strike a balance. The conversation never happens in those terms. Conversation always happens in terms of, oh, we do not have seat at the table kind of conversations on one side, which we are all very familiar with. Or we are having these conversations around, okay, we are running an extremely tight ship, but we're just not being effective in what we do, which is essentially something that's skewed more towards rigor, but truly not knowing what practices you should be adopting from the HR domain. So I think it's really striking the balance, and I don't think it comes naturally to HR.
And that's interesting. What we often see is HR tends to be very focused on process and less around the rigor, the discipline that's required to actually solve the problems of the business that deliver value, as you first described. So my question to you is, as we think about the fourth industrial revolution, where technology is going to be integral to the way work happens, and technology and humans have to work side by side. So we're talking about a very different way of operating. So as you think about the future, what do you believe is required for the HR and L&D function to be successful? And specifically, if you could talk about skills.
I think, I've had time to think about it. In fact, I've had time to work on skills of the future, I think, as a part of the work that I had to do for an IT industry body. So as part of that process, we worked through and identified literally 55 emerging roles and a whole slew of skills associated with all that, right? But let's simplify all of that, right? I think if you simplify all of that, in my head, it kind of comes down to three major facets. And three facets. One is around problem finding and innovation. So if you just think about innovation, conventionally we think about problem solving. How do we come up with the great new ideas? That's what conventional innovation is about. But reality is, today problem solving is becoming mundane. With the advent of artificial intelligence and fairly this whole new domain of deep learning, that's the cutting edge artificial intelligence domain, problem solving is no longer going to be a major hurdle for anyone to create value. The big skill required is problem finding. What's the next big problem to solve? And what's that next big problem that I can solve on behalf of my organization, wherein I can leverage the capabilities that have been already built, where I can actually leverage the relationships that have been built. So that's really, problem finding is a major thing, right? And innovation is going to keep getting tilted more and more towards problem finding. And that's really one big facet, if you will, right? And there are a few skills associated with that. Second major thing is around organizational change. how do you actually start to understand this whole notion of complex adaptive systems? How do you actually operate effectively in complex adaptive systems? How do you enable collaboration? How do you enable effective conversations in settings where you don't have a whole lot of control? You don't have a lot of vested power in your roles. How do you still work with networks to create value? So there's a whole domain around managing networks, creating network of networks. This whole thing, if you simplify it, it's really about understanding how to work in these kind of complex systems, complex adaptive systems, right? That just happens to be a group of human beings. So that's the second big facet to think about. Third big facet to think about is really how do you become far more customer centric? So again, there is a whole set of skills. I mean, the most hyped ones are probably things like design thinking, job to be done, JTBD, stuff like that, right? Very customer-centric digital practices. All of these elements exist. And at the center of all of it is really technology acumen and your own domain acumen. In this case, it's really about HR. How does the HR practices operate and really interplay with these three things that I spoke about? One of innovation, one of organizational change, and one around this whole customer centricity. So how do you actually interplay? How do you modify your HR practices to actually be effective in each of these three facets while leveraging technology? So that's kind of the most simple model that I can think of, right? I think as you start to look at the future of our practice.
I think that's very helpful. So I'm going to summarize. What's fascinating to me is use the word problem finding and not problem solving, which is much harder, knowing what problems to solve. And I think there's a lot to discover over there. It's where the source of innovation. If you find the right problems to solve, like, for example, Amazon first trying to, when they first created the e-commerce store just for books, who knew that that was the right problem to solve to build a $1 trillion business?
Yeah, and my favorite example, Shreya, is the candle industry. So candle industry is one of the most flourishing industries out there. Why is that, right? If candle is an instrument of illumination, it should have been obsolete by now, right? I think except in probably areas where still electricity has not got to, and there are remote pockets of the world like that. But for the better part of it, candle should have gone away. Except for the fact that someone sat down and said, okay, what's the new purpose of candle? Can candle be an instrument of offering ambience? Right. Can it be a luxury item? Can it be scented? And that built the whole industry. It is the same solution adapted for a new problem. It's a classic example of problem finding. Yeah.
I love that. That's a great example. So problem finding, organizational change, particularly how do you leverage networks, and customer centricity, sort of these three things, three systems that are operating, and the heart of it is technology and people. And what you said is HR needs to be very good at understanding what HR programs can bring all of this together. And the way we think about it is really understanding at a human level what humans can do, what are humans good at, and what technology is good at. So from our perspective, and you and I have had these conversations before, is understanding what is, having a good understanding of human capacity, just like when you go to a doctor understands the human body, your financial analyst understands, portfolios and knows how to help you make the right investments. HR needs to become experts, not only in systems and organizations, but also people. And so, I just, took the liberty to expand a little bit on what you were talking about. I want to talk a little bit next about some of the things that we have done together with you when you were at Cognizant Technologies, where in our practice, I see you as one of the biggest proponents of evidence-based practice in really helping HR and particularly the L&D team that you led, become the experts on learning systems as well as how humans learn. So my question to you is, what caused you or what has led you to become a proponent of evidence-based practice? And I know from having known you all these years, you're constantly reading and expanding your own knowledge. And every time I speak with you, I learn of something new because learning is part of who you are. So, but not just any learning, you really know how to go after what has value, what has an evidence-based basis to it, which is the language that we talk about all the time. So talk to us about what value you see in evidence-based practice.
Sure. I think if you just have to think about it, right, I think it's very pragmatic to use or to be kind of a follower of evidence-based practice or an adopter of evidence-based practice. In business, you work with patterns that have worked effectively in very specific context, be it deal context, deal management context, or a customer problem-solving context. You're always looking to minimize the risks involved by going with patterns that have been effective in the past. For example, you know the pattern of negotiation in a deal management context, and you kind of try and see how you can actually use it, obviously being very sensitive to the context, knowing what levers change and things like that, right? So I think when you start to think in terms of HR and talent, to me, evidence-based practice is that one piece of the puzzle that can truly help you combine rigor and depth. Because when you think about the whole depth part, the very fact that you're actually looking at something that has truly worked, that has a true basis for why it has worked, is very important aspect of the depth. And the very fact that it is fairly organized, structured, allows you to execute it very efficiently, execute it in a managed model, which is basically the definition for rigor. You are able to actually make it happen. So more you're able to actually abstract things as evidence-based practices and you can actually use it. I think in technology, you would see this concept of design patterns, which are basically software design patterns, which basically have worked in a specific context. So really great technologists and great technical developers actually know all about the design patterns, all the patterns that exist out there. It's like knowing all the opening move combinations that a chess grandmaster would know. Having that information allows you to just figure how to do pattern matching. In any context, you can actually figure, oh, it is this particular practice that I should be applying. That's a great way for HR organizations to kind of literally leapfrog through this practice, to this phase of performance where they can actually combine rigor and depth. So it's almost like a shortcut or a time warp through which you can basically just get over there. And that's kind of how I see evidence-based practice.
Wow, that's fascinating. I couldn't have explained it better than the way you did, which is ultimately it helps you leapfrog because you're not reinventing the wheel. You're using what works and helps you get further. And every other discipline does it, just like you said, in software. So it's high time that HR adopts it too. And also it's the unique piece that only HR can bring to the table. Because if they're leading by intuition and a manager can lead by intuition, there is nothing differentiating the two of them. And it's harder to demonstrate value. So very, very powerful. Thank you. So let me ask you specifically, how have you benefited? How have the organizations that you worked at benefited using evidence-based practice?
I think in two major ways, if I have to think about it, right? One is it has allowed me to create scalable models. So you can start with something, you can basically create an execution unit, and then you can actually start to replicate it, right, without really losing the effectiveness. So this whole there is always this thing. I have seen this more and more in learning and leadership development, that effectiveness and scale can't go together. It's considered almost a trade-off. So people would say, okay, we can do this training very effectively as long as we do it with 10 people. But if you're going to do this with 1,000 people, the effectiveness goes down. That's really just because in my head, it's because we have identified the right kind of models that can scale. So we've got to figure how do we create scalable models. And in that, having a core which is based on evidence-based practices allows you to far more easily create scalable models. Just having evidence-based practices is not adequate. You still have to figure how you're going to prepare the people at various levels to be able to, especially be sensitive to context, especially be sensitive to the variations in problems that are going to come and hit them. But once you get through that, you create scalable models. That's one. Second is you can create self-sustaining models, because part of putting a unit of execution that has evidence-based practices is that you can create feedback loops. And by creating feedback loops, you tend to be able to create self-sustaining models. So those are the two huge things you think about scalable models, you would think, okay, models that scale are automatically self-sustaining. That's not true, because models that scale are self-sustaining as long as the context don't change on you. But today, that's never an automatic assumption. Companies are changing, markets are changing, people and their preferences are shifting. So everything is shifting. So you've got to figure, how are you going to bring in self-sustaining attributes also into these models? So those are the two major things that I have seen where evidence-based practice gives you a leg up.
You're listening to the podcast on exponential talent. Today, our topic is leading L&D innovation using evidence-based practice, and our guest is Hariraj Vijayakumar. So, Hari, you've talked about the importance of rigor and depth in HR and L&D. When you were the Chief Learning Officer at Cognizant, how did you build rigor and depth in your teams, and what led you to focus on this particular aspect for your team's development?
It's an interesting episode of my career. When I moved from a business role onto the talent side. And what I expected in my role, in a leadership role in talent development, that I would inherit a team, an organization that's fairly good in terms of execution, and but have great depth in their respective practices. I think what I saw was a significant gap in terms of the rigor of execution. So I was used to seeing a much higher rigor of execution on the business side, and then when I came here, didn't see that. That threw me off a bit. But what threw me off the most was the lack of depth in prospective practices. What I mean by that is I had very well-intentioned practitioners, whether they are in instructional design, whether they are in some other specific area, let's say learning measurement. Everyone really starting following some stuff which is on popular literature, what is currently of high value, if you will, and really not paying attention to enough research, enough evidence out there, real practice-based evidence out there, and figuring out how should we get better, and when I say better, how should we get more effective at what we do in that specific area. So in both these areas, I found a big gap. So my first task, if you will, or really the first objective, was to gain a balance in rigor and depth at the same time. On the rigor side, I think it was fairly well-established models around how do you plan to meet objectives that matter to my customer stakeholders. How do I actually track to those things? How do I make improvements on a regular basis? Things of that nature. But on the depth side, it was a bit more complex problem for me to solve. Here were a set of experts that I'm talking to. I'm an outsider, and I had to really help them understand that this so-called expertise is not good enough. And we have to go far deeper if we have to be able to create value for our customers.
Let me just explain to our audience what you mean by an outsider. So just as a reminder, you came from the business. And so you're expecting the same level of functional rigor as you've seen in the business. and hoping that your team will educate you. And what you are saying is, as we hear in many HR teams, it wasn't the case.
That is correct. There would be no depth of information coming from these practitioners, but moment I go into the fundamentals of, okay, how does that create value for the business? And how are you delivering that value on a regular basis? I think the whole conversation falters. And I think that's where we started speaking about, okay, how are you leveraging what's the latest and greatest research in your practice around this? And the conversation would invariably veer into, here is what is in vogue today, right? Here is what a lot of articles are written about.
The good old best practice, right?
Exactly. And I would get frustrated because we are not able to go down to the fundamentals and answer those simple questions. So one thing I fairly early on established is the fact that we need to go back to capability building. And we needed to do capability building in a slightly different way. We could not have done that in a very superficial manner. So I really got consensus with at least a subset of my so-called experts on how to actually start building capability. That capability that matters, that can create value for our stakeholders. I think once we did that, and Shreya, I think as you know, your firm, HCG, was a big part of that capability building route, because we were looking for partners such as you who knew what was real, right? What was valid, based on the depth of research backing things up. So you always knew what's popular literature versus what's actually scientific. That was one big thing for us. And the second thing was, you were striving for excellence in terms of the capability that your learners would build as they go through the programs in terms of how they would apply things. So I think as we went through that process, we started seeing some clear results, right? And I can talk to you about one of the stories that stay with me all the time. And I think in terms of how some of these practitioners, and some of them were fairly senior practitioners, and some of them were fairly mid-level practitioners, but all of them very well qualified with their educational background, fairly well respected by their peers within the company as well as outside. Well, I think one of the examples that stood out for me was this one person who went through your workforce development program. And I remember this person being part of, and one of the key things we were always encouraging each of these learners to do was to choose a project where they're going to apply these principles. So they have this, so for lack of a better word, an action learning project that they were actually tagging themselves into and to try and apply these principles. I saw this example of this specific person was working on a fairly cutting edge learning innovation project. What I mean is, it was a project in which we were heavily using cutting edge technology to figure out how do we promote collaboration and teamwork without really pulling these people out, pulling the employees out into a classroom training or into a virtual or any kind of classroom training. So this person was actually working with certain things around facial recognition technologies, social technologies, quite a bit of data crunching involved, all of that. And this person was part of a bigger group where all of this was going on. What I found interesting was, as the person started making progress in terms of actual learning about workforce development, she started questioning the basic principles of design that they used in developing this program. Now, remember, this program was already in pilot phase. They had kind of completed their design. They were starting the implementation. There was quite a bit of investment done already in terms of how this project was. And more importantly, every other part of my organization was looking at this project as the seemingly the most cutting edge project across this place. And here is this person who is not the senior most practitioner saying, "Oh, maybe we haven't got this design right." So I recall her starting these conversations with fellow designers who are more senior to her, explaining that, "Oh, okay, maybe we should relook at this design." And interestingly, there was some initial resistance. I didn't expect it any less. I think people are like, "Okay, we completed the design. We are now into pilot implementation. There's a lot of spotlight on us. Let's not rock the boat." I think she stayed with it. She basically insisted that we speak to it. I think she was able to articulate it, and I think one of the key qualities that helped her was the fact that she could articulate her logic pretty well and influence others. And I was able to watch this not by design. Incidentally, it was just that the building in which I used to have my main office was the same building in which all of this team was co-located.
Interesting.
Because of which I could actually see this playing itself out. And I could see that she actually got them to see that they need to make changes to the design. They made changes to the design and then went back into that pilot implementation. Why I bring it up is, I think it's two or three things, right? One is, here was a person who already thought she was an expert. Now she was willing to reframe her understanding of things based on your program. Second is, she took it upon herself to actually go out and work with folks who were initially resistant and really help them to see that there is a different way of doing things. I think these examples were the early signs of depth, if you ask me. And obviously, in parallel, we also worked on the rigor of execution. The rigor of execution part, I got most of my leaders to start adopting the good practices around execution, not very complex practices, but how do you plan things? How do you plan for alignment with your customer stakeholders? How do you track it? How do you measure better? So one of the big areas for us was, how do you actually measure better in learning? The conventional ways of learning measurement was just truly outdated, and we needed to figure out how we measure for value. And that's something I think most of my direct reports actually took it upon themselves to change the way they actually measure learning. So that was kind of the my early experience in terms of setting up rigor and depth. Hopefully that helps.
You know, what I'd like to add is, when you were at Cognizant, we, till date, it is one of the best implementations we have of the program, because learning was directly tied to implementation, just like you mentioned. And that's where leadership matters, because you were running this program as part of your bigger innovation effort to change the way the L&D function operated. And like you said, if I might just highlight a few things. One was knowing what is the business struggling with, what is the outcome that is important to the business, and how do you line up your practice in a way to maximize the probability of that outcome, which is what evidence-based practice allows you to do, and then measure, did we really achieve those?
That's correct. Yeah.
And for a business leader like you that is very focused on driving outcomes, what we see is that evidence-based approach is not an impractical solution, as you put it. It's great to hear from you that it actually provides you a very practical way for you to address what you're looking, the outcome that you're looking to drive.
Yeah, and I will add one more thing, Shreya, and I think I don't think I thought about it in this way when I did it, but now when I frame that experience, I also think about it as, you said it as a practical way. I actually think of it as one of the more optimal ways when it comes to managing risks of execution. You know certain things work, and therefore you're really minimizing your risk when you actually go with an evidence-based model.
Absolutely. I think well said. Well said. We always say manage risks and returns. People understand that in finance. The good news is there's a way to do it now with human capital.
That's correct.
So my follow-up question to you is, many HR leaders would like to drive innovation in their teams, and they struggle. You did it at Cognizant, you did it at your prior roles, and now you do it as your entrepreneurial effort. So, two questions. Why does HR LND struggle to innovate? And what can they do differently?
Interestingly, my view these days is that everyone struggles to innovate, right? And I think my understanding now is that any practices who are seemingly expertise based struggle even more, which is my thesis as to why HR and talent development or L&D professionals struggle quite a bit with innovation. The reason that happens is, so you can think of everything that's happening as things that happen in the problem space and things that happen in the solution space. As experts, we are always thinking about better solutions. Mm. And we are thinking about better solutions without thinking enough in the problem space to see, have we found the right problems to solve? So our whole learning has been, and I think we continue to see that in my entrepreneurial journey with my company Designs in Change right now, I think one of the key things that we're working with the customers is in this practice of problem finding. You've got to figure out what's the next big problem that the customers must solve. And if we are able to figure out what's the next problem that we should solve on behalf of the customer as HR and L&D leaders, we would get far more return on our innovation efforts. And it's very hard because we are very wired with a bias for problem solving, not with a bias for problem finding. We feel very uncomfortable staying in the problem space and looking for problems, refining problems. We would rather jump off to actually solving problems because we have learned, we have been taught that it's the solutions that matter. It's the actions that matter, actions around solutions that matter. So whenever you're trying to just look for solutions, you're basically just getting incremental value, even if you're successful. But if you actually figure out slightly bigger problem to solve, you get 10x return in your innovation. So that has been the big thing. And what, in my opinion, what limits HR and L&D professionals is, ironically, their expertise. Because they are experts, they have this big bias to solving the problem immediately. So we jump into solving. If we can pause that and basically say, okay, I'm going to stay in the problem space for some time, suspend my problem solving bias, and stay in the problem space for more time, get more information about customers' problem space, understand it a bit more before jumping into solving. I think the innovation will take off. Second big challenge is we all speak about fail fast and stuff like that, but we are very bad at implementing, right? Failure is considered failure. Failure is not considered part of the process. So that causes us problems when we are in the problem solving phase because we are not able to adopt approaches like lean execution in the solution space because we don't want to demonstrate and report out failures. So these are the two big issues. I don't mean to say by any means these are easy ones to solve, but I think if we can crack these two, I think innovation in the HR space and human capital space will be phenomenal, and that'll be of value to everyone.
You said something that's really insightful, very, very important, which is instead of focusing on problem solving, focus on problem finding. But there's something inherent in what you said, which is not just problem finding, spend enough time with your customers asking them questions of why what they're asking you to do is important. So in my experience, most of the HR function, including L&D talent, is very much in a service role, eager to service their leaders. Problem finding, now you're asking them to ask, but for what reason? Solution for what reason? And we don't do enough of that.
Yeah, I would say one more thing. It's not just asking them the right questions. It's more about observing them in their settings. Because even when you ask a question, more often than not, the business person is answering in the way they think you want to hear the answer, which completely changes the way. So example, you go to someone and ask them, okay, what's your leadership issue? They're basically thinking, okay, you're a leadership development person. Let me tell you what the leadership development issue is. So, and then they will tell you something along the lines of, okay, they need to develop on strategic thinking, right? And then you run off to solving strategic thinking for a set of leaders. The real issue might have been to do with the fact that they got an execution problem.
Right.
But only if you observe them in their problem space, you would actually know the problem that they are dealing with. So that's one of the key things we've got to get better at. And as I said, right, I think every expertise-led practice, not just HR, has this challenge.
Yeah, it's kind of like, if you have a hammer, then every problem looks like it needs a hammer to be solved. So makes sense. So in your current role, you're helping companies change, lead transformation. Probably, that's probably the single most important thing we're hearing from most organizations. They all need to transform digitally. What role do you think the people function can play in leading business transformation or contributing to business transformation?
Big one, right? So I truly believe talent and technology are at the center of any of these transformations that we are speaking about. So, and obviously there is a transformation in the way the talent does the thinking, in the way they are actually leading the larger teams, and the way they are doing things, right? So in terms of thinking, leading, and doing, there is a shift expected to be able to achieve the kind of business transformation many of these companies and their leaders and investors are looking for. And to achieve that, they need an engine that supports that change. And that's the place wherein the HR organizations, the L&D organizations can play a massive role. However, for them to do that, they've got to truly understand what this transformation is about, and be able to make that connections all the way back to what it means for the individual. And that's not an easy one, because it's not one simple equation. There probably are multiple equations that you've got to write for different constituencies of talent within the organization. And then you've got to have the skills to drive organizational change. Let's put it this way: to drive certain change in skills, drive certain change in behaviors. Let's not use the word organizational change, right? But I think if you are able to make certain shift in beliefs, make certain shift in the skills that are required by these different constituencies, and the kind of behaviors they need to demonstrate, a big part of transformation is really over. Right? So to make it a fairly complex thing, I think the issue is, again, as I said earlier, if the HR function or the HR organization remains in the problem space of business transformation, understand it quite a bit before coming into the solution space of thinking about talent transformation, then they can crack it. Because the difficulty is not so much in figuring out, how should you, or what are the slivers in talent transformation that you need to act on. The difficulty is really getting the frame right, the problem frame right, one. And difficulty is also in having the skills to drive the change in skills on the employee side and driving the change in behaviors on the employee side. I think that's really been the big learning for us as we work from client to client. It's always the same pattern. Yes, there is some level of high-end work involved initially in terms of helping the leaders frame the transformation, think about business transformation in the right way. But the moment we are done with that part of the work, working with the business leaders, the big challenge is then helping the HR organization think about the talent transformation in the right way.
And I'll add, there's a middle layer in there, which is even getting HR at the right time into the conversation in a way that's a value add. And that's where we're seeing a lot of, businesses, HR doesn't add value, and HR, has a perennial struggle to find a seat at the table. And the way we're seeing things is, well, have something unique to add. And I remember in one of our prior conversations, you said, well, if business leaders are leading by intuition and HR is also leading by intuition, they're not bringing anything new to the table. So this is another place, I guess, HR has to be the experts on people, be able to forecast and anticipate what is likely to happen. I clearly see the picture that you're painting of why the people function has to be central to any transformation effort.
Yeah, and Shreya, and I'm a firm believer that HR organizations get enough opportunities to sense what is going on the business transformation side. I think my own thinking, and not just thinking, right? I think I've seen enough evidence of it, is that in many situations, the sensors are not fine-tuned enough to pick up on the fact that there is a business transformation that's going on, and the fact that we need to pick up on those things and get really engaged in that conversation, create or add value to those conversations to the business leaders by bringing in that expertise on the people side. Mm-hmm. It's not that business is not looking for it. Business is absolutely looking for that early on. I think it's just a matter of them not finding those valued conversations early on, which is the reason why this whole behavior of we will tell you what to do after we have figured out everything, that the behavior that comes from the business.
And so what you're saying is, come with your unique expertise and be part of the team rather than wait to be told.
That is correct. I think that's exactly what I'm saying. I think it will be very useful if we are constantly having our sensors or antenna in what's going on in the business. And the moment we start to see the business having the conversations around transformation, because their world is shifting, they are actually thinking about transformation. It's an uncomfortable space for the business leaders. As a leader on the talent side, if you're able to start to help them frame those conversations, help them understand the implications on talent, I think there's no reason why they wouldn't engage you from day one.
Great advice. Well, so before we end, this has been a fabulous conversation, and I always have so much more that I want to ask you, but I know that you're pressed for time and love for you to come back again. But before we end, what advice do you have for CHROs and CLOs to prepare their teams to be better human capital partners to the business as well as to employees?
Yeah, I think just based on what I have seen so far, I think if we are able to really just build the depth using these kind of evidence-based mechanisms, help the team build the depth and help them build rigor. So always continue to promote the balance between rigor of execution and depth. That's one. Second is help them to stay in the problem space longer. It's not an easy one. And third is help them to accept failures as part of the process in the solution space. If you get these three right, I think you automatically tend to get very customer centric, and that's really all most business leaders are looking for. That would be my humble advice.
Three things: find the right problems to solve, use balance depth and rigor to deliver the right solutions. And what was the third one that you said? Measure the outcome.
And from an innovation standpoint, right? Help these accept that failure is part of the process. Help fail fast.
Fail fast, fail early. Got it. Well, thank you. I hope that we have another chance to have this kind of a conversation and share it with the world. You and I have great conversations all the time. And so thank you and wish you all the very best on your endeavor, which I know is going fabulously well. Designs and Change is becoming a leading transformation agency in India and hopefully soon around the world. So I'll be watching and learning, and hopefully coming back to you to share with the world what you're learning.
Shreya, thank you so much. I always absolutely enjoy our conversation.
There you have it, listeners. Our podcast with Hariraj, former Chief Learning Officer at Cognizant and now CEO of Designs and Change. Every time I speak with Hari, I walk away seeing a better connection between business and the people side of an enterprise. His ideas on innovation, particularly for HR, are enlightening. Hope you gained as much as I have from speaking with Hari. Today, listeners, I'd like to ask for a favor. We're working hard to spread the word about our podcast. If you liked what you heard, would you please send a tweet or leave a comment and help us get the message out? Much gratitude and thank you to all of you. Until the next time, this is Shreya Sarkar Barney from Human Capital Growth.